Welcome to the MacMillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Shibashis Chatterjee, the Fulbright-Nehru Visiting Professor at the MacMillan Center and a professor at Jadavpur University in India. His research interests include international relations theory, foreign policy, and security policy in South Asia. Today, we'll talk with Professor Chatterjee about his forthcoming book, Power and Territoriality, India's Imagination of South Asia. Welcome, Professor Chatterjee.
Thank you very much, Marlene. It's really a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Let's begin with an overview of your book. Tell us about it.
Well, the book is, as you rightly said, it's tentatively titled as Territoriality in South Asia, which basically looks at how India became territorialized and what territorialized sovereignty does to India's foreign policy in its immediate neighborhood, which is broadly speaking South Asia. So what I intend to sort of do in this book is that I look at space and I define space, let's say very broadly, as three possible configurations. So you can have space as power, you can also define space as a marketplace, which is basically space as commerce, and you can also define space as a meta-community of sorts. So the hypothesis of my book is that, for reasons that I explain in the text, Indian foreign policy decision makers have always viewed, and this is also sort of in a way, I think, extendable to South Asian elites as a whole. So what I argue in the book would not only hold true for India, would also be true for other South Asian states. So the foreign policy elite in India, they define space in South Asia as a space of power rather than space as market or space as community. So that's the broad, sort of argument which I have. And the follow-up argument I make is that this is obviously not an inevitable sort of denouement. There are reasons as to why South Asia, in fact, is a zone of power or a space of power, which is broadly sort of explained by the fact that the underlying models of politics that prevail in South Asia, they are of a particular kind. So I make the argument that if the nature of politics in South Asia changes, then the conceptualization of South Asia as a space, in fact, would also change. So one of the arguments that I'm making here is this, that we need to pay more attention to the way in which speciality, in fact, is configured in the area, rather than sort of looking at how, one or two states, they converse daily with each other. I'm not saying in the text, in the book, that this conversation, in fact, is unimportant. But what I'm saying is that relations tend to move between certain fixed terms of references. And they're predicated on certain conditionalities. And my text is about illuminating these conditionalities and predications. So that's what broadly the text is about.
Okay, very good. And what led you to write the book? Where did you get the idea?
Oh, that's a very interesting, sort of question I find. I guess there are two motivations, Marlene. First is that, I was intrigued by two very different genres of writing, on Indian foreign policy and South Asian politics. One of these, in fact, are writings by realist scholars who are broadly, let's say, interested on questions of power and military strategy, let's say. And they write on issues like India's rise as a great power, what that rise, in fact, what kind of impact that rise would have in terms of India's reach, what kind of power projections India is capable of making in the short run and also in the long run, perhaps. And also things like, indicators of national power, which could be military capability, nuclear weapons, missiles, satellite, capability. And also broadly, let's say sort of economic, various economic indicators that I think run into any definition of national power. In contrast, sharp contrast, in fact, to it, in fact, is a very critical body of literature that, in fact, has gradually sort of, let's say, accumulated over the years, which is, in the absence of an agreed term, described as a kind of a critical post-colonial literature on Indian state-making, Indian foreign policy and security policy. This body of literature, in fact, looks at some of the constitutive principles of the subcontinent.
Okay.
What made us? I mean, why is it that sovereignty, in fact, has taken a particular cast in South Asia? We could have been something else, okay, but the way in which we relate to each other, some of the political principles and institutions that we have, and some of the major challenges, in fact, which we face existentially, particularly in the domains of politics and security, they need a kind of a historical, sociological, analysis,
Okay.
which questions some of the things that the realists and others, in fact, would take it for granted. The problem that I faced while reading this literature, in fact, is that these two, bodies of work, they never talk to each other. Okay, so there is a conversation of sort, but that conversation is at each other, but not to each other, let's say. So one of the reasons that I wanted to write the text, in fact, is in a way to begin that kind of a conversation.
To kind of draw both sides into one conversation.
Yes. Not necessarily because I want a via media of sorts, not necessarily because I wish to, sort of reduce the distance or anything of that, because I think these are principled positions of, I think, opposition, let's say, and I don't think a kind of a compromise is possible. But a conversation is definitely, sort of possible. So therefore, I agree with the realists that the security issues are real. And I also agree with the post-colonial and the critical, genre that one needs to, one needs to plumb deeper and one needs to sociologize and problematize some of these categories, okay, with a critical sort of, let's say, trajectory. So my problem with the realist scholarship, in fact, is that the realists, in fact, would take almost virtually everything for granted, okay? The problem with the critical scholarship, on the other hand, is that they would often leave a problem there. In other words, they would critique, but beyond the critique, there is virtually nothing. I mean, if you say, for example, that, okay, if you are territorialized, then you are territorialized. That doesn't really help, okay? Because we are territorialized, and I don't think that the unbundling of territoriality is something that is going to happen. Nobody's going to give up sovereignty or something of that sort.
Right.
So therefore, I think it's on the responsibility it's one of the responsibilities of the scholars, that we need to at least analytically have something more here, which might in some way or the other percolate to policymakers.
Okay.
Because my text is essentially not a policy-friendly kind of a text, but I do feel that, it would in a way open up the space between the academic writings on one hand and the policy-making discourses on the other, because I feel that unless you understand what exactly you wish to do in life, you can't even experiment with alternative possibilities.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's talk about your methodology. How did you do the research for the book? And I know, being here at Yale, you've had access to some of the resources here, so tell us about it.
And first, Yale had been simply fascinating. Okay, the kind of resources that I had been able to draw from the library, in fact, has been absolutely mind-boggling. The problem with Indian, sort of libraries had been that it's basically a problem with positive resources, I guess. Particularly in a place like Kolkata, like Gestor or, Project Muse and other resources that we have. They don't even have 1/3, if I may say, of the kind of journals and all, which a place like Yale, in fact, would subscribe to. So it's been incredibly beneficial. Well, the methodological part of it is, in a way, again, a little bit intriguing in the sense that, look, this book has been in the making for a long time. And if a project is actually, sort of happening for a long time, it has both advantages and disadvantages, possibly more disadvantages than advantages. But one of the advantages of the book being in the making for a long time is that I have been able to, I think, pack in a lot of very interesting stuff, which I would not have been able to do if I had completed writing the book about maybe 3-4 years back.
For instance, what kind of interesting stuff?
Like, for example, there's a very interesting body of work that has come up in the last 3-4 years, which looks at things like, India's citizenship, India's understanding of migrations and borders. There's very interesting stuff which also looks at how India relates to the diaspora. So this work, in fact, has opened up new vista, okay, even for conventional, sort of, let's say, geopolitical analysis. Right. I'm very thankful that I delayed my own work, okay. I mean, particularly 2-3 books that I could, in my mind, almost sort of close my eyes and recall. Right. Those have been very, very, I mean, sort of, useful in terms of, I think, benchmarking my text. The method as a whole, in fact, is a straightforward one, in the sense that, I mean, I don't do any empirical testing or anything of that sort, because my interest in international relations is broadly political theory driven. Okay. So as a political scientist, my specialization is also in some way broadly political theory and international relations theory. I've always been an interface kind of a person, let's say. I've always loved to read more political theory than anything else, but I've always written more on South Asia and try to sort of theorize South Asia. So the book uses conventional methods like, I mean, sort of, I did a lot of talk with the foreign policy elite in India. I took interviews, had conversations, exchanges. I followed closely all the public documents that the Indian government, in fact, have released. You can't really get to files because these are classified files, and India has one of the strictest sort of classification rules in the world. So unless, of course, you are trying to sort of, in a way, get around the problem through WikiLeaks and other, I mean, sort of stuff that is available. But then I haven't really looked into those kind of stuff much. Okay. My book is more about meaning than anything else. I mean, so I'm basically looking at broad political theory debates and international relations debates, for example, and see that how they impact on it. You can't really have a kind of, let's say, meaningful ethnography of foreign policy decision makers, because foreign policy is so high end. But on the other hand, you can talk to people on the ground and try to understand that why, by and large, people are not interested that much in foreign policy issues in India, although, in some way or the other, foreign policy do come to their life. So I did a lot of, I mean, sort of, interesting interviewing, of people living on the border and people living far away from the border. Okay. And also,
is there a difference in
there are big difference, huge differences in perceptions. I mean, people who are away from the border doesn't really make much of a difference. Right. International politics doesn't really interest them so much. I mean, international politics of South Asia. But if you are on the border, that's existential virtually. I mean, it impacts virtually on every dimension of your life. And there is also an increasing federalization of Indian foreign policy. You see, I mean, New Delhi, as the home of the Ministry of External Affairs, would decide most of foreign policy issues. However, in the last few years, some of the provinces have become more important, okay, particularly when it comes to deciding on, neighborly issues, like, for example, the state that I come from, West Bengal. When it comes to foreign policy decision making on Bangladesh, West Bengal, in fact, have often exercised a veto. The same is true of Tamil Nadu in south, which in fact had a very big impact on India's Sri Lanka policy. Okay, if you're looking at Nepal, a state like Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, in fact, these states, in fact, have had impact on how India, in fact, sort of relates to Nepal. So these things have happened of late.
Right, and also Pakistan, I would imagine, too.
Pakistan is a bit, I would say, a bit exceptional, in the sense that if you're looking at the neighboring states, it's Punjab and Rajasthan broadly. There's a bit of Gujarat, which is also, I mean, sort of borders Pakistan. But the federalism that we are witnessing right now is not really very strongly influential in the making of Pakistan's India's Pakistan policy. That is primarily because of the extraordinary geopolitical, competition that you have between the two states. But on the other hand, when you look at issues like how commercially the two Punjabs relate to in Pakistan, or in terms of some people-to-people contacts, which unfortunately, in fact, have come down, sadly enough, in some in the recent years. There, I think the provinces obviously play a big part. Right. Okay, the two Punjabs, they're culturally quite. Why do I say quite? They're very, very close, as the two Bengals are, for that matter. So so in terms of method, yes, and as I said, I mean, so it's basically a book that's based on conventional analytical method. and I look at published reports, look at use interviews and stuff like that,
Okay.
and then leave it to my analysis.
Right.
Yeah.
Let's talk about foreign policy. India's foreign policy imagination of South Asia remains constant. Why do you think that is?
Well, that in a way is what my book is arguing, Merlin, which is that I find that even if political power changes in India, the foreign policy orientation in South Asia doesn't change. Okay, which broadly, I mean, I'm not basically making the argument that you will not have any variation in terms of bilateral ties, okay, because bilateral ties are susceptible to almost sort of, let's say, daily developments, okay. But if you were looking in terms of the cast of foreign policy, if you're looking in terms of the quality of policy, let's say, there is a remarkable degree of continuity there. And I read that continuity in the constitution of the subcontinent itself. The fact that we became territorialized with an obsessive attachment to sovereign territoriality. It basically sort of means that no state, in fact, is very comfortable in fully opening itself up to the other. Okay, so the past, to a large extent, looms on us, and it looms on us in manners that make us, I think, extremely nervous in
And do you
freely
mean
dealing.
the past, do you mean colonialism?
Yes, the
Okay.
colonial past. But the major point that I'm making here is this, that foreign policies seem to be moving from one point to the other here, between fixed references. And my text is about explaining these fixed references. I mean, and my basic argument here is this, that unless you have a very different kind of politics growing in South Asia as a whole, and particularly in India, which in fact would be, I think, let's say, confident enough of taking risks, I do not see any possibility of any transformation in the underlying ideas of foreign policy, particularly when it comes to India's foreign policy in South Asia. One of the facts that I'm looking at, in fact, is a very well-known, what you call, is a very well-known fact, which is that one of the reasons why India, in fact, finds it very difficult to grow as a power is because its neighborhood is fraught. So you've been living with it for more than 70 years now, okay, and nothing seems to be radically sort of changing. A lot depends on what kind of a regime you have in the other state. So if you have a regime that is friendly to you, then relations improve. But the basic orientation doesn't change, okay? That's my basic argument. And my point is that that orientation is never going to change unless we are ready to question some of the heritage that we have.
And how would you question them? What do you think needs to happen for that to happen?
Oh, I mean, I think I've no doubt about it, which is the only way that we will be able to question that is provided both democracy and liberalism become strong in South Asia. Okay, unfortunately, I don't see that happening. Democratization is obviously becoming stronger in South Asia, but strong democracy doesn't necessarily mean a culture of strong liberalism. Okay, I mean, so the difficulty that I see in South Asia, in fact, is that South Asia, in fact, has never really been a liberal space. Okay, I mean, India possibly had been more liberal compared to many other post-colonial states or many other third world countries. But Indian liberalism, in fact, is a very, again, a deeply divided kind of liberalism. So essentially, it's that old, I would say, contradiction between what's important, whether it's the calculation of majoritarian considerations of democracy, when numbers really, seem to dominate, or is it really the prerogative of the individual? Okay, so the notions of selfhood, if you look at it closely, I think remain deeply, deeply, I mean, sort of, let's say, convoluted and debated in the subcontinent as a whole, and also in India, and particularly if you are looking in, in the last one decade. Why one decade, even 2 decades, let's say, we find that Hindu nationalists, in fact, have gained in ground, and a kind of cultural nationalism is growing. So my thesis is, it's not really my thesis, but it's a commonly held belief, I guess, that as cultural nationalism becomes stronger in India, a kind of conservative, anti-liberal communitarian project is going to gain ground.
Interesting. So, and what do you mean by cultural what is it?
Nationalism.
Yes, what do you mean by that actually?
Oh, cultural nationalism, in fact, is broadly, let's say, a political paradigm which makes the argument that if you want to regain your position in the world, you need to tidy yourself domestically. Okay, so what is tidying up? Tidying up would basically mean that you need to homogenize. So heterogeneity is weakness. So how do you tidy? You tidy on the basis of some of the old notions of culture that in fact had brought stability in India over the millennia, which is that you have a kind of a hierarchical model, which is very coercive, but hierarchical.
Like the caste system?
Like the caste system, yes, very much so, which in fact produces order, but order at a great cost, okay, which is coercion. Now, that project obviously has become deeply contested in India, okay, with the empowerment of the lower caste and stuff like that. But then those who are pending the cost of cultural sort of nationalism, they're making the argument that unless India regains some form of homogeneity, which they define in terms of their Hindu-ness, and also in terms of a political Hindutva, which is not really, sort of entirely synonymous with what Hinduism means in religious terms. But unless India is able to do that, India's prospects of graduating as a major power, in fact, is doomed. The problem with that idea is that it is a complete antithesis of anything that is remotely liberal.
Right.
Okay, and the second, that this project, in fact, would be deeply divisive and utterly convulsive in its immediate neighborhood. Okay, because some of these problems, in fact, they source in the neighborhood historically. And my book doesn't really discuss these things because it's an excellent literature that exists on this right now. Okay, so the historical part of how we became territorialized, how we were enumerated by the institutions of modernity, all these, in fact, are very much there. Okay, so I don't really write on that. But how we take it from there, the fact that we are territorialized, and now we have the prospect of this cultural nationalism, which is also trying to draw in the diaspora and some of the exhibitionism of that, which I think, was also apparent in the election campaign. So I think all these are ominous portents, if you ask me, of the kind of things that might happen in a state like India, which is not going to compromise the democratic, aspect of the equation, but it's going to definitely, I think, weaken the liberal side of the equation.
Okay. Yeah. And talk a little bit about how your book is different from the other texts that are out there. I mean, you've kind of touched upon it a little bit, but go into it a little bit more.
I think my book would be different in three ways. One, it's a book which is not about India's rise as a major power. I'm not interested in that question. Already a lot, in fact, has written about it. And I don't think that I can really add anything, which is interesting there. Second, my book is not about bilateral relations of India in the subcontinent.
Okay.
So what is my book about then? My book, the point of departure of the text, in fact, is this, that I want to understand why, despite the fact that South Asians are culturally one people by and large, so our shared cultural heritages, in fact, are very well historically, sociologically, anthropologically documented. Why do we end up producing so much of political violence? Okay, so you have cultural similarity at on one hand, but on the other hand, you have very fraught, international politics on the other, or very fraught South Asian politics on the other. So my point of departure, in fact, is that kind of a question, which is that why is it that this similarity actually doesn't bring us together, rather that they tend to sort of, create more and more, I think, more and more divides, more and more divisions, and raise ugly questions, again and again, again and again. I mean, I'm sort of reminded of a statement which the erstwhile Sri Lankan president, in fact, the Sri Lankan Prime Minister, Rajapaksa, in fact, was talking about. it's a good, in a way, it's a microcosm kind of argument. He was asked that what is Sri Lanka's problems with India? Okay, and this question assumed significance because Sri Lanka's relations with China in the last few years, in fact, have improved,
Right.
okay, a lot. So he was asked this question that, why are you moving closer to China? What's your problem with India? So he gave the answer. The answer is something like this. He said that, look, with your relatives, you will have issues at times, issues which you don't have between your friends. Okay, so that's an interesting, sort of an argument, okay? But then if you unpack that, there is a lot of sociology and there's a lot of, I would say, anthropology that goes into the making of it.
Right.
So my take, in fact, is that, my take is this, that if the states in South Asia are nation states, but South Asia historically had been a meta-state kind of an entity, okay? It's always been a sociological space. So what had happened with the arrival of modern South Asia is the scission between the two, the disjuncture of the two. So the territorial logic, in fact, has almost virtually colonized the other logic, which is the societal, or I would call the meta-societal integrative logic of South Asia.
Okay.
And I wish to, in a way, focus on the interaction between the two.
Right. And then ultimately, what do you conclude in your book?
Well, I conclude first and foremost that, as I said at the beginning, that if we have to understand South Asian politics, if we have to understand India's South Asian policy, we need to understand the politics of territoriality. We need to understand what we relate to the institutions of, or how we relate to, rather, to institutions of sovereignty, and how modernity, in fact, have reconfigured us. Okay, so that's the broad, argument which I'm making in the book. So I make the argument that there are these alternative politics in India and in South Asia also. So you would have, strong communitarian politics. You would have, realists who are broadly nationalists or liberal nationalists, for example. And there are, a group of radicals who are mostly based in civil societies. And so therefore, unless, strong, radicals or very strong liberals, in fact, they come to dominate the political imagination of South Asia in general and India in particular, I do not think that the politics of South Asia, or India's perception of South Asia as a space, rather, in fact, is going to change. I draw on the work of a very famous sociologist, Henry Lefebvre, whose book on state and space and power, in fact, had made arguments like, we need to understand this whole business of territoriality very closely, okay? So the making of the territory, how the states, in fact, use these strategies of territoriality, and the territorial effect, which means that once you are territorialized, how does it affect your thinking? So in the South Asian context, in fact, I'm trying to, in a way, conclude by the fact that we are very deeply territorial. Okay, so our thinking, in fact, is almost entirely dominated by this notion of territoriality. We are so deeply, territorial that we forget that we were not territorialized for much of our, much of our history. Okay, particularly if you're looking at the colonial times. So broadly, this would be the conclusion that I'm making. I take myself as a social scientist that I have a duty to facts, to empirical facts, and so therefore I put on hold my own normativity. Okay, I do not say that what exactly is the kind of politics that I prefer and where South Asia should, in fact, move towards. My argument, in fact, is that I see certain trends, I report those trends, and I try to explain those trends.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Very interesting. And your book will be coming out early next year?
I don't think it would come out early next year.
Okay.
I would definitely be over with the manuscript, by January 2017.
Okay.
And then, then I have to find a publisher.
Sure,
Yeah,
okay.
I've had some initial talk,
Uh-huh.
okay, but then it's only initial. As you know, I mean, the manuscript would be rated. So it's a pretty
Yes.
long process.
Process,
I would be very happy if it sees the light by the end of 2017.
Okay, good. And we will hope to see that as well.
Thank
you
you
so
very
much for
much.
being here with us today.
Thank you very much. It's
Okay.
been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For more information about Professor Chatterjee and his research, please visit our website at macmillanreport.yale.edu. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the MacMillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty MacMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.